Jean, when you came up to Cambridge, what led you to read anthropology at that time?
Well, I suppose it was much what leads people to do it now. I was tired of what I was doing at school and took the advice of someone who suggested I do anthropology. I didn't know much about what it was, but I thought I'd try anything.
But you had a background in the colonies and elsewhere.
Well, yes, it was a background I hid rather to start with, but no doubt that was why my father's friend, who'd done anthropology herself at Cambridge, suggested that I would like it, and she was quite right.
You had been born in Kenya?
Yes.
And you lived there for how many years?
Well, I was there most of my life until I came to Cambridge. My father was a colonial official, and we used to come to England, home as we called it, on leave. But that was stopped because of the Second World War. And so I hadn't been to England very often before I came here. But I didn't know I was a colonial until I came here.
What did you think you were?
I thought I was English.
I see. But your father hadn't even been born here?
No, but he'd been to public school and to Cambridge. And he thought of himself as English too, although his family lived in Turkey.
And they'd lived there for many years?
Oh, generations, yes.
Ever since the original La Fontaine?
Oh no, the La Fontaines left France and then they wandered about a bit. They went to Switzerland and England, and only then did they go to the Levant. But professional migrants, I suppose they were. My father just continued the saga.
But your father's family were presumably in trade or mercantile
well,
activities.
they spread into all aspects of business. My grandfather's particular expertise was in rugs and carpets, which he both collected and dealt in. But I don't remember him very well.
But so when you came here, you had been at school in Kenya when you came here?
Yes, I went to the government school, which was considered a rather radical thing for my mother to do in those days, send me to the government school.
And when you arrived in Newnham, you didn't have any idea of reading anthropology?
Oh yes, when I came up for interview, I said that although I had done my interview on history, I was going to read anthropology. And at that point it became clear that they had a rather odd idea of who was coming from the colonies too, because I was sitting in Newnham waiting for my interview and they called Miss La Fontaine, so I got up and the secretary said, "No, no, not you dear, the girl from Kenya." And I had quite a time to persuading them that it was me.
You mean they were hoping you were black?
I think they were hoping I was black.
Yes. So you did, you came up in 1950.
But yes.
And that was before Maya Fortes had come here.
No, it was his first year. We were his first intake of undergraduates, I suppose.
And who else was doing the teaching at that time?
There was Ethel John Lindgren, a very dramatic lady with a fur hat, about 6'3" she seemed to me, followed by a rather small husband who was a millionaire in lap terms. We understood he had reindeer all over Sweden.
Yes, I think that.
And she was my supervisor and taught me mostly how to annotate. I had always to put footnotes in my essays and refer to them, and if the numbering was wrong, there was hell to pay.
She supervised you in your first year?
Yes. Oh, lots of people supervised me in my first year. I started off by being supervised with Anthony Forge by Doris Wheatley.
Yes.
And then I was supervised by G.I.Jones, largely because I was radical enough to suggest that I wanted to change supervisors. Nowadays that will pass without any worry at all, but in those days it was considered a very daring thing to do. In fact, I completely upset my director of studies, who was a dear old lady called Mrs. Quiggin, author of Primitive Money, and she asked me at the end of the first term what was, I suppose, a rhetorical question, but I was too naive to recognize it. She said, "And are you happy with your supervision, dear?" And I said no, and she had never had no to that answer before. She was very upset. So I was changed and transferred to G.I.Jones, who was a marvellous supervisor, except that he had a room in the museum, which was rather creepy at night.
He kept his skulls in there, as I remember.
It wasn't the skulls, it was a particular West African student who frightened the life out of me one day. I was going through the rather dark museum to supervision with G.I. Jones when this figure materialised out of the gloom and said, "You're from Kenya, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "Do you know," he said, "what was the greatest blessing of West Africa?" "No," I said. "The mosquito," he said, "it kept the white man away." And then he dematerialised in the gloom. And I went to my supervision with knees knocking, and I was always frightened of the totem poles forever after that.
And who else was teaching you at the time?
There was Geoffrey Bushnell with his dog, who was a great hazard because it was deaf and also liable to be upset and bit in lectures if you disturbed its sleep. So you had to be careful to make sure it wasn't underneath the bench where you sat, or it was dangerous. And then there was Jack Trevor, who did physical anthropology, always somewhat of a mystery to me, and Miles Burkitt, who I remember crawling under the desks in the lecture room to explain to us how it was impossible that Paleolithic art could have been made by accident. And he crawled about under the desk explaining that this was similar to getting down into the caves at Lascaux-les-Aisies, and clearly primitive man must have gone there on purpose.
That was your archaeology.
That was archaeology.
So
yes.
in those days you were doing archaeology, physical anthropology, and social anthropology for the first year.
We had a 2-year part 1, but it was changed in the middle, so that we had just done a 2-year part 1 with archaeology, physical anthropology, material culture, as well as social anthropology. And then we had to somehow fit in a 2-year part 2, which is what it changed to in one year.
Yes.
Which included an optional subject, which could have been statistics, social psychology, economics, or something else I can't remember. But
Linguistics, was it? Perhaps
I
not.
don't know.
It's mostly still the same, as you know.
Yes. Nur Yaman and I took economics, which was more disastrous, I think, for Peter Bauer, who taught us, than for either of us. We didn't understand it, but he was upset.
It was called colonial economics, as I recall.
It had to do a great deal with the price of oranges, as far as I remember.
Cocoa beans, I think, in West Africa.
No, this was the first. Yeah, there was part 1 of the economics tripos, or part of it. Not specially designed for us at all. And as far as Noor and I were concerned, completely opaque. But I suppose we didn't believe what the basic assumption that other things were equal.
Apart from the teachers that you've just mentioned, there was just, you say there was just GI, Maya Fortes had just come here, Ethel John Lindgren.
Yes.
That was it.
No, you taught me at one stage. And various research students did teaching. Emrys Peters was here and taught me for a while.
Yes, I didn't mean as, yes, the old people who were pulled in.
There was Reo Fortune.
And Reo was here, yes.
Who also taught me.
Yes.
Which was very alarming.
Was it? Why?
Well, Noor and I used to go to supervisions with him about from 11 o'clock, I think it was, downstairs in the old department. And his room had a window onto Downing Street. And at some stage during our supervision, but it was never clear, it was never exactly the same time, there would be a bang on the window and a voice would shout, "Meat!" And Reo would rush to the window and open it and bring in a parcel of meat. But of course the tension was waiting for this interruption, because it would always disconcert Reo and it used to alarm us, and besides his conversation was a bit hard to follow.
You learned something from him, did you?
Not a great deal, but he was a very charming character, and one Noor and I used to go to his lectures, not because we could really follow them, but because we liked him and we felt someone ought to go to his lectures. We once had a bet, a competition rather, not a bet, as to who could take notes for the longest in Reo's lectures.
You probably were the only two students there. As I
Yes.
recall, the great thing was to avoid being the last student left there because you had to come back the next week.
Yes. Well, we did try and organise a rota between John Blacking and Noor Yaman and Anthony and myself, but it was very difficult to organise.
You've recited a few names of your distinguished co-alumni. There was Anthony Forge was there at the same time,
Yes.
and Noor Yaman,
Mm-hmm.
John Blacking, you just mentioned.
And Julian Ree,
Yes.
who had a marvellous digs in, was it the Oyster House, Garlic Row?
That's right, yes.
Yes, he's
yes.
got a little bit.
He didn't, he was not one of the ones who became a distinguished anthropologist.
Well, he's made a lot of money, perhaps. better.
He's, yes, director of Longman Greens, yes.
And then there was the mysterious Anne Peters, whom you may remember, who was a very clever girl. She was a Hungarian refugee, much younger than we were, and she'd only started to learn English when she was about 16. She really was very clever, but she went to Canada, and I've never heard what happened to her. And a few other people who came into anthropology from other subjects after part one, like Martin Southwell. And Wyatt McGaffey too, who was in America.
Was Wyatt McGaffey here at the same time?
Yes, he and Martin Southwell came from English, I think, into anthropology in part two. So they took 4 years and finished, I think, a year after I did.
And Reynolds, was he there at the same time? That doesn't mean anything. Barry Reynolds.
No, it doesn't ring a bell.
Campbell?
Yes, he was just ahead of me.
John Campbell.
John Campbell, yes. And so was Malcolm Raw.
Malcolm Rule was here
yes,
at the same time.
Derek Stenning and Ray Smith were just going out into the field when I was a first year undergraduate.
Yes.
And came back before I'd finished. I think. I remember Derek showing me a large book and asking if I read French. And so when I said yes, to test me, he handed it out and said, well, what's that? And I read The Elementary Structures of Kinship. And that was to be, what, 1950, I suppose? 50, 51. He just got it.
So the Derek Stenning and Ray Smith went off in your first year.
I think so. I'm not very clear about that because they were certainly back
And
before
they
I
were,
went into the field,
yes.
which was 1953.
When did you finish your degree?
53. I went straight into the field.
Did you?
Terrifying.
Without any more ado?
Not much more ado. Finals was in June and I was in the field in November.
What was it that financed your going there?
Well, I had what was known for some administrative reason as a junior bursary at Meharry College,
Yes.
which meant that I had a scholarship, a
Yes.
research scholarship, attached to the East African Institute of Social Research.
And that was being run at the time by...
Audrey Richard, who was my supervisor in the field.
So, in fact, you got your fieldwork training out in East Africa with
On the
Audrey
hoof, so to
Richard.
speak, yes.
And she had a planned program of some kind.
Well, she used to call you in from the field from time to time to give you a
Yeah, I mean,
report.
before you went to the field.
Well, before I went to the field, I was told to learn to type, and I had to have a session with Wilfred Whiteley, the linguist, to work out the outlines of the Gisu language, which had not been written down. And we found a student at
But
Meharry.
who directed you towards the Gisu? Or did you stick a pin in a map?
No, Audrey Richards did. In fact,
I see. Well, there was some direction.
There was a plan of research, and I had the choice of either going to study the Gisu or participating in a research plan in Buganda.
Because
as
all
part
this
of the
was
team.
part of that program that Raymond Firth, was it, had made out for East African research? No, not
Not
Raymond
Raymond.
Firth.
Shapiro.
Shapiro had made out, yes. Raymond Firth is the West
Well,
African one.
It was partly that, but partly it was negotiated, I think, with the Uganda government and interests of theirs.
Yes.
The Gisu were important because they seemed so different from all the interlacustrine peoples. They were uncentralized initiation rituals,
Hmm.
very heavy emphasis on unilineal descent, all that stuff.
And it was intellectual reasons that they wanted somebody to go there, not because they were causing trouble at the time, or...
No, they had caused
Yeah.
a considerable amount of trouble, but that was some
Most people did.
10, 15 years before.
Yes.
And they were quite satisfied with what they'd finally obtained, which was a land commission, which
Mhm.
said that they had individual land tenure.
Yes.
And I was instructed by the African local government, which was largely Gisu, not to inquire into any matters concerning land, because that was known and settled. Otherwise, they were quite pleased to have me around.
Who was largely Gisu, did you say, at that time?
The African local government,
Were they?
the council, yes.
That's already in 53.
Yes. At the time, Bugisu was incorporated in a larger district which took in part of the plains area, but just after I left the field it was split, and in Bali district then incorporated just the Gisu and the Sabe, who were their neighbours. Nilo Haimatsu and the Gisu were Bantu speaking.
And then, so it was Audrey Richards that directed you or suggested the Gisu. And she surely must have given you some of her famous instructions about note-taking, and
Yes, she was very-
what coloured pencil to use.
She was very firm. She gave me an outline that Malinowski had given her to go into the field with, because she said it was a useful fieldwork check no matter what theoretical framework I might prefer. And indeed it was useful, because she reminded me at one stage that I had sent in nothing on house building, which was part of the material equipment for the family institution, and it's quite true, I hadn't.
Mm-hmm.
She gave me that. She also insisted, because she was very nervous about people losing notes, since she had lost notes, she insisted that we type our field notes with carbon copies which were sent to her. So carbon copies went off once a week to her in Meharry, and she would comment or not as she felt inclined. We were also...
And you typed these out?
Yes, well I had to learn to type beforehand.
So every evening you sat there in the
typed.
tropical twilight, bitten by these non-existent mosquitoes.
I sat by my pressure lamp, yes, and typed away. It was very
Yeah.
hard work, because the villagers all went to bed about 9 and were up at 6 in the morning, and they thought I was very lazy, because I didn't get up till 6:30. But the fact of the matter was I might as well have been typing till 12 the night before.
So you sent all these back to Audrey,
Yes.
and she returned them to you with
No,
comments
she
on.
kept one copy.
Mhm.
I had the top copy, she had the carbon copy,
Yes.
which were, as far as I know, were still in Meharry, though whether it is now, whether they are now, I don't know. And then occasionally we used to have to come in and give a field report at a conference. And she was very firm about that. That was one of the few disagreements I had with her, which I lost. She wrote to me saying that she wanted me to come in and give a field report at a conference
Yes.
on such and such a date, and I wrote back saying that I couldn't possibly make that date. It was much too soon. There was something going on which I would miss if I had to go to Kampala, which was 200 miles away. And no, I certainly couldn't come. And by return, I got a little letter saying, "Dear Jean, for politeness' sake, I may have phrased my suggestion as a request, but it was, in fact, an order. See you on the whatever it is." So I went. She was, of course, quite right. It was very good for me to write up the stuff, but I was right in that they did the twin ceremony as soon as I left.
You never saw it again?
I never saw one.
And how long were you working from Meharry?
Well, nearly 2 years. I left in October 55. So I had it longer in the field than people have nowadays, but I was less trained.
You had 2 years in the field?
Yes, I had some holiday because to help me as far as the family was concerned, I was locally employed, and therefore I had holiday at Christmas, and I went to see my family in Kenya then.
Mm-hmm. But
it was basically it was 2 years. Yeah.
And then you didn't spend any time in Meharry writing up. You came back here.
I came back here to write up, to start doing terms for my PhD. The terms of my scholarship included 3 months writing up.
Yes.
After that, I existed partly on cashing in my pension and partly on some supervision and postgraduate scholarship I had from Newnham.
That was because the scholarship was just for 2 years, plus 3 months writing up.
Plus 3 months writing
yes.
up, and then
yes.
I had to find ways of supporting myself after that, and partly it was, as I say, accumulated pension for the 2 years, which seemed quite a good sum in those days, and partly it was teaching, and I did some research assistantship for Audrey Richard on East African chiefs, and some research assistantship, I think, for my 40s on ancestors.
When you came here?
When I was here, yes. We lived, most of us, from hand to mouth, but it didn't seem hard. It does now.
How long were you here doing it?
2 years. I got my PhD in 57.
And who was supervising you? Meharry?
Meharry was supervising me, and we had a very lively graduate seminar because Edwin Leach had come here by then. In fact, so lively was it that Grace Harris and I threatened, if you remember, to buy police whistles in order to make a space so that we could say something, so that we could be heard.
I do recall that there wasn't much room for anyone except
certain people to
certain
speak.
people.
And they spoke loudly and long and with great heat. But it was a very good seminar. It was quite frightening to give a paper to.
Where was this held?
In King's.
In Meharry's room?
Yes. It had, as I recall, great windows with long curtains. And Edmund Leach would sit in the windowsill, and when he was disgusted with the conversation, he would draw the curtains and disappear from sight. And then there would be silence for a while until he poked his head out and reached on his conversation.
Yes, there were various ways that Edmund had of disguising his presence. Esther swears that on the first occasion she gave a paper there, he was reading the Cambridge Daily News the whole time.
Oh, I wouldn't put it past him.
There's not much, there's not that much in the Cambridge Daily News.
No, but all these ploys, we were taught, and we were with people who were the grand eccentrics, I think.
So who else were your graduate students at the time when you came back?
There was Frederick Bath was here. I hadn't known him before, but he had come from Fieldwork in Swat.
Yes.
And was writing his up then. And Michael Banks, who'd worked in Ceylon.
He wrote something for the volume that Edmund did, yes.
Was in the throes of writing what turned out to be one of the longest PhDs in anthropology ever, I think. Not quite, but quite long. He was here. In fact, his was the first seminar paper in the graduate seminar I heard, and I was so frightened by the polemical reception it got that I thought I'd never dare to give a paper. Who else was here? Canadian, Bill Dunning, worked among the Eskimos, and Grace Harris was still here. She had taught me a bit as an undergraduate, and she and her husband Al were still here, I think, when I got back, briefly.
She had taught you here in Cambridge?
Yes. Who else did we have? I remember you as a positive presence, arguing with all and sundry.
I'm sure, yes.
Martin Southwell came back while I was still doing my PhD, because he had gone out to do the Buganda study that I chose not to do.
Yes.
He hadn't had a choice but fellow come second.
Mm-hmm.
Nur Yaman came back.
He was back from Ceylon.
Yes. And who else? There was a changing scene, but it was very lively. We seemed to spend a lot of time with each other and in the pub discussing anthropology and related matters, very often related matters.
And then you finished in 57.
Yes.
And then you went to America for a while.
Then I went to America for a year, yes, on Harkness Foundation to Chicago. And after that, I got married and left anthropology for a while. So
What were you doing at Chicago?
Not a lot, because I had this lovely fellowship, which was postdoctoral, and so I had no obligation to do teaching, no obligation to take any exams, and in fact, I did write a paper for the AAA conference, but mostly I just explored the American social science field. I got a bit bored, and for a while I took an unpaid job, which was very hard to get. It was very hard to persuade Americans that you wanted to work for no money. And I took this place with the Chicago Herald Tribune in the Market Research Department to look at quantitative methods. I had wanted to get a job on the Skid Row project they were running in Chicago, but they wouldn't have me because I was female. So I did this instead for a while. It was very interesting, enlightening. Taking around questionnaires was quite appalling. But it was something I had never done, so I learned it.
You were walking around knocking at doors?
Yes, with a questionnaire which, if the respondent was in a good mood and quite educated, took 3/4 of an hour. So you can imagine how long it took with someone who was either busy or reluctant or didn't understand. It was a terrible imposition, it really was. And then I went on Greyhound buses as far down to the southwest and down to New Orleans and one or two other places to see America. So it was a very pleasant year, not very hard working.
And then when you came back, you got married.
Yes,
and you became interested in more pragmatic matters.
Well, I did bits and pieces of anthropology for a while.
Well, you did quite a lot, I think, didn't you?
Well, I taught in Kinshasa for a while, largely because they had absolutely nobody else to fill in the time. The university was Jesuit-run, Catholic and Belgian, so that to employ someone who was at best Protestant, at worst atheist, female and English, was something that they could only bring themselves to do because they had absolutely no choice. It took years off my life learning to lecture, or lecturing in French, but luckily the young Congolese, Zaire, had not much better French than I did, so we muddled along together.
But you also did some research work when you were there.
Yes, Jim Bahanan had got a massive grant from Ford, I suppose, to do a comparative study of 12 African cities, and he was sort of dealing them out like hotcakes. He'd wanted me to do a re-study of Brazzaville, which had been done before the First World War. But since diplomatic relations with the ex-French Congo were currently broken, and there was no ferry, I declined to do that, so he suggested I did a study of Kinshasa instead. It was still called Leopoldville at that time, and it was a very dislocated sort of a place, but I enjoyed the field work in a way. It was urban study and very difficult to try and work out how one was to even start in. I was supposed to be studying urban leadership. Well, most of the urban leaders in Kinshasa were ministers and presidents, all dead and in exile. They had been translated to quite another framework, so it was a bit difficult to...
But what were you, I mean, how did you set about this? I mean, it wasn't, you were doing a study of a whole town, which was
a huge
large,
town,
yeah,
yes,
huge,
full of
complicated
refugees.
town.
Well, what I did was rather crude. I had very little training. got to know the various localities, which seemed to me have different characters, partly because of the way they were built and the date at which they were built. And then I picked 3 areas of the city to investigate and took a sample, a random sample from the dwelling units, and did structured interviews in each house. I say 3. My third was going to be part of the squatter areas, but it became so violent there, and outsiders were chased out with sticks and stones, that I decided that I would not pursue my inquiry.
Which year was this?
It was the end of 1962 to the beginning of 1963. I was supposed to do this in 6 months. It was a rather crazy project, I must say. But I did something. It's a bit shallow, but it was something. I enjoyed the place.
And then but you spent a lot more time than 6 months in Kinshasa, obviously.
Oh yes, we were there for nearly 2 years. We went out there in November 61 and were there until June 63. So I had a year in which I was teaching part-time in the university and not doing research before this started.
And then from Kinshasa you went to Rhodesia,
now something
Zimbabwe.
Completely different, yes. We were sent to Rhodesia where we lasted 8 months. We were posted there for 2 years, but we were declared persona non grata after 8 months. Came back to England in a hurry. So I don't really know a lot about Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, Meharry.
And then when you came back here?
Then when I came back here, I started teaching at Birkbeck, college in London, which suited me at the time because the children were still quite small and Birkbeck teaches at night.
Yes.
So that I would teach 6 till 9 on one night a week and do classes 6 till 9 on another night in the week, and I could still be a reasonable mother at home. And I did that for 3 years and then went to the LSE where I've been ever since.
You went there in?
68, just in time for the student uproar, the second student uproar.
Yes. Well, now that you've said something about your own career, what about a few words on the subject of those anthropologists you've met along the line, like Audrey Richard, for example?
Well, I've said quite a bit about her in the introduction to her festive. She was the most lively person. The Institute of Social Research in Kampala revolved around her in a very special way. It was not perhaps run like clockwork, but it was certainly an amusing place to be. And the dramas were always so vividly recounted when one came in from the field, which I did, I suppose, 4 or 5 times during my 2 years, not much more than that. There's always some late crisis. There was the driver's nose, which had been cut off by his walking through a plate glass window, and how it was perfectly all right, it was going to be sewn on, and the right way, said Audrey. Think how clever. There was the drama, which I also recounted in her Festschrift, of the fact that the college authorities had got their surveying of the land wrong, so that they built a portion of Audrey's director's house on someone else's land. And he, being a cunning Uganda landlord, waited until the walls were 5 foot high before saying anything, and then said with great amiability that perhaps they could share the house. Now, the whole institute admired Audrey for her calm and coolness in the face of much provocation, because he would be sitting on the veranda, ready to greet her when she went round to inspect the house, saying, "How pleasant it will be in the future when we can sit as neighbours on our veranda and contemplate the experience of our lives." Audrey said she was all for participant observation, but when it came right in the living room she thought it was a bit much. Though she was an extremely sympathetic and encouraging supervisor. At times one despaired of ever making sense of anything, and she was always ready to make the right question pose the right questions so that you then started to think on more constructive lines or point out what you had already said to her. It was a great pleasure, and she assembled a team of very interesting people, so that although one tends to think of the social life and the entertaining things that happened there was also a very good coordination of research. There were some odd occasions, and I think Audrey herself despaired of us in some respects. She once announced at the conference party that she thought the younger generation was doomed because they seemed to her to have no initiative. When I was young, she said, at conferences like this, we would be having a great time, dancing, singing, sleeping around. What do you lot do? You sit here and drink, she said. Feeble, I'd call it. We were all a bit disconcerted by this, and wondered if this was her oblique way of referring to the fact that she pretty well knew what was going on in all directions, whether it was obvious to anyone else or not. But she was a very great director of the Institute, and I think everyone was very fond of her, however much it, so many times they battled with her, which they did as well.
Who was there with you at the time?
Aidan Southall and Lloyd Tom Fallows. Who else? There were a number of people working in Buganda. After I think it was Martin Southwell only at the time. Audrey herself was working in Buganda. The Bohannans, for part of the time I was in the field, they worked over the border in Kenya.
Oh yes, that's right, on their second field trip, yes.
That's right, and this was a great triumph really for women's liberation in those far-off days, because Audrey employed Dusty Bohannan and persuaded either the college or the Colonial Social Science Research Council to send Jim as a dependent spouse. And that was a long time ago. And she had to fight for it, but she achieved it in the end with great satisfaction. There were a number of economists. There was Hugh Fern and Christopher Wrigley, I think.
Yes.
And Walter
Banana
Elkan.
Wrigley. Walter Elkan,
Walter
yes.
Elkan.
At Belfast.
So there was some it was a general social science research unit. It wasn't only anthropology. And with a number of things. There was also a child psychologist who came from the States, his name escapes me at the moment, who had to be persuaded that it was useful to learn the language if he was going to study children. And in the end did some quite interesting work on the ideas Ganda children had of authority and how these related to particular features of the political system. But it was quite difficult to persuade him that participant observation rather than questionnaires through interpreters was of any use. It was in fact very multidisciplinary. What else is there? Ed Winter, Beyond the Mountains, was Beyond the Mountains of the Moon, with
yes.
his very southern wife. She had the most amazing American accent I'd ever heard at that stage. I mean, American accents were new to me, and this was a deep Southern Belle accent. And another couple of Americans who worked in Kenya. Cindy, they worked on the Tariki. Name I've forgotten. So there was quite a big team. The Bahannans were possibly one of our most exotic. I had a weekend with them in which I think, as I told you not long ago, I was utterly exhausted in 2 days because their work patterns were such that the visitor was torn in half. You would sit after dinner talking to Dusty until 2 in the morning, when you would both go to bed, only, in my case, to be woken with a cup of coffee at 5 in the morning by Jim Bohannan, who'd gone to bed at 10 o'clock and was fresh as a daisy at 5 and wanted to discuss all manner of things. So that after 2 days of this regime I had to drive my motor car very carefully home in sleep for 3 days to recover. They were very lively. But we were encouraged to visit each other in the field. Stephen Morris was there, doing his study of Indians, and one weekend we went to Karamoja, to the north. The general factotum, who was cook, bottle washer, general bodyguard, whom I employed, refused utterly to accompany me. He said, they eat people up there. So I said that, well, I don't think you're very loyal to let me go and be eaten. Oh, he said, everyone knows that white people are all right. They don't eat whites, they just eat me. We got involved in a wedding, which
Yes.
was quite frightening because the Karamojong are very enthusiastic people, and we couldn't communicate with them very well except through a little bit of Swahili. And at one point we thought we were going to end up in some celebration 5 or 10 miles from the car, and we were not going to be allowed to go back to it. However, we did manage to escape. And I recall a conversation between Barbara Ward and myself about the initiatory practices of that part of the world, and I confessed to my ignorance, not knowing whether the Karamojong or the Turkana practiced circumcision or not. And we were debating this in a rather animated way when Stephen broke into our conversation. He said, if you look out of the window directly to your right, you will be able to observe the answer to your question. And there were 3 very tall men wearing nothing but khaki puttees, which they had acquired from some military friend. And indeed, I can inform you that they do not circumcise.
And was Karamojong subsequently Gallagher was up in that area?
Well, Gallagher was further over among the Turkana. It was Dyson Hudson.
Dyson Hudson.
Who was in fact here, but he was Hudson when I knew him. When he did his research, he became Dyson Hudson.
Oh, did he? Yes.
And
yes.
he did, with his wife, who was an ecologist, did a study of the Karamojong.
Yes.
And changed the spelling of their name, which caused me a great deal of difficulty somewhere.
But Gallagher was out there at that time?
Gallagher had gone back.
Ah.
I didn't meet him until later.
Mm-hmm.
Or else he was for a spell government anthropologist in either Kenya or Tanzania. Perhaps he was doing that when I was doing fieldwork. But he'd finished his fieldwork when I was there.
Well, you got this, you were working at Meharry, which was one of a number of institutes of this kind which the Colonial Social Science Research Council set up after the war. Did you tell us something more about the activities of your director there?
Well, she accompanied me to the field because she said she thought I was going to be a shock to the district commissioner. And in fact, she was quite right. I was a terrible shock. He sat there looking at me, saying he didn't know that anthropologists were young. I think he thought they sprang fully fledged at 80 out of some book.
With beards, which you didn't have.
Preferably with beards,
which
yes.
you didn't have at that moment.
At that time, I was not yet 22, and he was horrified.
Yes.
What was worse, he discovered that he'd been to the same school as my father, and they were both in the colonial service, so that he felt even more...
And your father was senior.
Yes, yes, and even more responsible. So what did he do but suggest that I stayed right with him and do my fieldwork from there. So Audrey spent the weekend persuading him this was not a good idea, very successfully.
Mm-hmm.
And then we left, and then came the incident which I think Audrey told several people as how I saved Jean's life for anthropology. Because as we were leaving, Audrey had charmed the DC out of all his objections, though some were to surface later. And so when we were leaving, he said with utmost amiability, "You're not going to take the long road all the way round to Roro, are you?" And Audrey said, "Well, I didn't think there was any other way." He said, "There's a new road. Let's take the new road." And Audrey said, "Is it open?" So he said, "No, but we're all using it." So he explained how we got onto it. And true enough, it was the most marvellous road. In those days, a marvellous road was a gravel road, and Audrey speeded up her car, and we were zipping along at 60, and she was talking about what she thought I could do in Bugisu, when suddenly we came to the end of the new road, which was signalled by a large tree trunk across the road, whereupon she stepped with great efficiency on the brakes. We went round in 2 circles and ended up with the bonnet right in the tree branches, in dead silence. She backed away a bit, and then it was clear that everybody else had gone round this tree, so we followed the track round the tree. And as she accelerated onto the main road again, she said, "Do you know what I was thinking?" I couldn't think of anything that anybody was thinking, so I said, "No." And she said, "Well, I was thinking, you know, I may be killed, but Jean will only be seriously injured." I thought it was quite kind of her. But the field work was, it was such a surprise, because in those days we didn't talk about it endlessly beforehand, and I can remember walking through a plantation of bananas and thinking, I'm in the field, now what do I do?
But you had read, no, you had not read Chisungu beforehand, because it wasn't published.
No, it wasn't published. I had been lectured to by Ethel John Lindgren on the advisability of learning string figures, so that you could sit in the middle of a village doing string figures, and someone would be bound to come up and ask you what you were doing. The point being that you would then discover which member of the village could speak your language.
That was certainly a piece of advice descended from the Torres Straits expedition.
That's it. That's all I
remember. Because
remember.
you remember, when you were here, the librarian was Kathleen Rishbeth, Haddon's daughter.
Yeah, indeed.
And she had written a book on string figures.
So we got string figures.
So that it was very important to do string figures in those days to amuse the natives, and so the natives could amuse you. But
I was put into a convent to start with. So I
well,
spent in Bugisu, the DC, having not been able to get me to stay with him, decided the next safest thing was to put me in the convent of the sisters attached to a mission.
Yes.
Which disconcerted both them and me, and took me 6 weeks of weekly visits to get out of. I spent my time in the convent learning the language, which I was starting to learn, which was
Latin?
helpful. No, Dutch. No, I was trying to learn Bugisu.
Yes.
And trying to find somewhere to live which would be approved by the district commissioner. And eventually, the father, head of the mission, who was a very skilled man, great politician, said to me, "I know just the place for you. It's up on top of a hill, and the DC will not want to walk up and inspect it, but he will not want to admit that, so he will agree." And all befell as he had prophesied, and I was installed in this teacher's hut, right on top of a steep mountain, small mountain but steep, looking out down the valley. It was a very lovely place. It was a small hut, about 6 foot in diameter. No, radius, sorry, never know these things. And right on the edge of the sort of green in the middle of the village. It was very convenient for the children, because they could always come and congregate and see what I was doing.
And that's where you spent the next 2 years?
No, I spent a year in that village.
Yes.
And then I spent 3 months in a village on the edge of the plains where I got some unpleasant disease, so I moved up into the hills again and spent the last 8 months on the border with Kenya, which was high, but in another part with another dialect, or slightly different dialect. So that I moved around, but the place that I know best was the village I spent a year in, and where I was given a name and was considered part of the community eventually.
Well, you must be considered part of the community to come from such a genteel background and then get involved in all these bloody male rituals. How and why did you do that?
Well, I think it was you who said once in a seminar that anthropologists got the peoples they deserved. I don't remember the other examples very well, but I do remember that you finished the whole peroration on the subject by saying, and look, Jean got male circumcision, which was something which embarrassed me enormously at the time. However, it was...
Which you have a theory about, that I did this very generally, deliberately to embarrass you and others.
Well, I think there was a certain... It was considered unusual among anthropologists to find anthropologists who could blush, which I unfortunately did in those days. And I'm sure you weren't the only one who wanted to try and see if they could make it happen. But male initiation, I suppose, I might as well have been studied by a female. After all, I was far less frightened by it, or upset by it, than my colleagues. There was a film, which you may or may not have seen.
I remember vividly.
Exactly.
Yes.
There was a very vivid but silent film made by someone in the Public Works Department who was under my direction.
Oh, was it? Yes. Yes. No, I'm thinking of something
Well,
else.
he asked my advice and made
Yes.
it. And then when he came on leave, he wanted to recoup his expenses. So I talked to this film and tried to sell it to various departments. And in those days, departments didn't buy films. So I acquired a reputation which was, I think, undeserved as the girl with the horrible film.
Yes.
But he unfortunately didn't sell any of the copies of the film, and it was
No
a good
copies.
film.
There are no copies available?
No copies, and he's vanished. He was very disappointed with me. But the effect, I think, was very bad because of this lack of sound. And the rituals themselves were very noisy affairs. And with a lot of shouting and singing, and it distracted one's attention. But it was very hard work because a lot of Gisu large-scale rituals involve running up and down from place to place. And
Yes.
they always would say to me, we don't mind, as long as you keep up. We're not going to hold up anything so that you can be there. So that most of the time I seemed to be running uphill or downhill in the mud, clasping a camera and a notebook, desperately trying to get to places before everything had finished happening.
But they
I
take
lost
it...
2 stone in the field.
Did you? And yes.
Running up and down hills.
But the circumcision rituals were in one place, most of it,
The circumcision...
as I remember the film.
Each locality had its own rituals on one day. It had been
Yes.
tidied up in bureaucratic fashion, and for the first time the African local government sent a circular round allocating each county a day on which to have its rituals. And there were 3 weeks which covered all the counties through Bugisu, because there was no initiation on Sundays.
So
and I followed them from place to place.
There was already quite a lot of influence of the local government upon the rituals at that time.
Yes, they would gladly have done away with them, because they felt that they were holding up the greater assimilation of Western ways. They had failed to persuade the Gisu to be circumcised in hospital, and they had failed to persuade them to curtail their rituals to something rather small. It was a massive festival, but they had condensed them in time, so everything happened in an exhausting 3 weeks instead of spread over about 4 or 5 months.
What's happened to their ceremonies now? What's happened to the Gisu now in more recent times?
Well, in most
You haven't been
recent
back there
times,
since.
I haven't been back. In most recent times, they've suffered rather badly by being located on the frontier with Kenya and having participated with no doubt great enthusiasm and expertise in the smuggling of coffee into Kenya. But they were shot up rather badly by our means. 100 people, I heard, were killed in one locality. And they were, even when I studied them, very short of land, and a lot of them were in considerable difficulties. And I think this has probably been intensified. But the initiation ritual still goes on. And in fact, there is a film made some 12 or 13 years after I did fieldwork by Suzette Heald, which shows the initiation ritual in a different part, of Bugisi from the one I knew best.
Yes.
But it's obviously very vigorous, and it's not likely to lapse, I would have thought, or fade away.
So you think that despite all these pressures that were happening even when you were there, that a lot of this is still continuing today?
Oh yes, I would be very surprised to find it attenuated in any way. The missionaries and the government between them had influenced them a bit. 1936 age set is called fences. That was the year when the government insisted that they fence off the actual operation, because traditionally the operation was done in full view of everybody. In fact,
yes.
It had to be. And there was a little argument between the local chief and the African local government when I was there, because he had proposed to have a traditional ceremony for me, and the senior chief had heard of this and sent round to ask why there were no fences. And he said, she wants to see it traditionally. Traditionally there were no fences. So I had to back down there and say, well, I would see it the way they did it now. And the fences were duly put up. There was a certain amount of sulkiness. But it was intended to be public. The women were supposed to be there. I mean, one of the schoolboys I knew who was, well, senior schoolboys I knew who was an initiate, wrote and said, will you come and admire me on my circumcision day? And this is what I was expected to do when I was at all known. Luckily I had one of those cameras that you can look in and blur the viewfinder, so I didn't have to watch the operation more than a few times.
The place that you were working at in Meharry during that period, I suppose a period which lasted, when did Audrey Richard leave Meharry?
Oh, quite some time after I left, 57, 58, something like that.
As soon as that she left?
Well, I think so. Didn't she come to be Smuts reader here? 59?
She came here, I think, and then was Smuts reader, but
yes.
I wouldn't be absolutely sure.
Because I worked with her.
No, she didn't become Smuts reader till later, I think.
I worked with her on the East African Chiefs book here.
Ah.
And I think that was 57.
Yes. Well, really, I mean, this period of these institutes, which, these social and economic institutes, and I think of the one that Max Gluckman, this was an earlier one, of course, but Max Gluckman and others, Dr. Wilson, ran in the Rose Livingston, the one at Meharry, the one in the West Indies, the one in West Africa, in Nigeria, which had rather a different shape to it. I suppose of all these, Meharry was perhaps the most important. But they all came at a particular period. They all came after the war as part of the process of the reconstruction of the world, the deconstruction of colonial society, the interest in development, and associated, of course, financed by the colonial office under the colonial and development welfare schemes, of course. I mean, there was a particular period when these happened in which you got a whole lot of people working on a number of projects in the social sciences. Very few of them natives of the area that they were in. But on the other hand, people that acquired a great deal of experience of these localities at that time, because they had conditions where they could work for several years in many cases. I mean, yours for 2 years, I think you said, but Audrey was there for longer.
Much
many
longer,
of these
yes.
other people, many of these other people were there
There were
for
5-year projects in those days. The Carnegie Leadership Scheme was a 5-year scheme, I think. That Tom Fowler's was
That's
working
right.
on, yes.
So Fowler's worked there for a long time. Many other people did that are noted figures now. So they got a lot of work in these areas, they worked in some kind of a framework, as you said yourself, with economists, with sociologists, if there were any that were to be separately distinguished from anthropologists in Kenya at the time, in Uganda at the time. And in a multidisciplinary setup of this kind, which was often led, I mean, by anthropologists. It was in Audrey's case, it was of course in the case of the Rose Livingston too, with Gluckman. And that was a kind of period which sort of phased out. Since then, no doubt, the whole situation in Uganda, obviously, as far as social science, has changed dramatically, with these institutes of this kind disappearing effectively. But what I wanted to ask you is what kind of change you think this has had, what kind of implications has this change had for social anthropology in this country and in America?
Well, directly, the political changes in Africa have meant that it is extraordinarily difficult for anthropologists to do fieldwork in Africa, or in a large part of Africa. Eastern Africa is now very limited amount of fieldwork can be done there. I hear students saying that we were puppets of a colonial regime, and I certainly recognise that we relied on the immunity of given us by association with the white colonial regime. I think I was so safe during fieldwork because I was white, so that in some respects one was able to establish what looked like ideal field conditions. Perhaps they weren't as ideal. I think that the balance has changed very much in where people can do fieldwork now. They can't count on cooperation, they can't count on peace and quiet to do their fieldwork. It has meant, I suppose, that reconstructions or studies of traditional customs are no longer central in African studies. This I don't find altogether a bad thing, although it is a mistake to think that none of us were interested in that even in those far-off days. It is also a mistake to think that we always met with compliance. On one or two occasions I had some very difficult situations to cope with. But generally I think the fading of African ethnography from the scene in terms of its contribution to central theory is very marked difference, which you can see in the anthropologies of the 70s and 80s. Whereas before, the central theoretical issues were debated in terms of African anthropology, now they aren't so much. It's New Guinean or Latin American or Mediterranean even, not so much central, don't you think?
You mean because New Guinea and Latin America are were later colonial situations in which people could pursue the activities that earlier you pursued in East Africa under the shadow of the Australian flag, or in Latin America under the protection of the descendants of Spanish conquerors.
Yes, I wouldn't have phrased it precisely like that, but I suppose there is a certain sense in which this is so, though there is also a very clear indication that a lot of anthropologists have worked in both New Guinea and in South America with the view of protecting, supporting and helping the people they study against the oppression of any wider religion.
Well, that is right, but then that of course was true in Africa too.
Yes, it was. It was very much
I
true
mean,
of us.
Audrey was writing for the Fabian Journal, and other people, refugees from South Africa, etc., who were interested. I mean, that's just why they were working there, because they were interested in the same kind of thing. But I didn't mean that so much. I mean, the shift from working in those kinds of situations there, and you say there's been a shift from the central role that Africa played at that time in social anthropology. It isn't just a shift of geographical focus. I mean, it's involved other shifts too.
No, a lot of other shifts. That was the one that sprang to mind, and at the moment, I felt that being attached to an institute was an extraordinarily lucky thing for a young anthropologist, because I could have supervision while I was in the field. I didn't have to go out once for all with a contact mediated through rather rare letters and then come back and that was it.
Yes.
I could go back and forth between the field and my supervisor, not a great deal, but I did do it, and discuss problems. I also could talk in a multidisciplinary framework with people who would give me advice on various aspects of field work. I knew nothing about how coffee grew, for example, and I got that information quite quickly during the field, during my field work. So, whereas now we are sending our students out with much less time available, and they go out and they're more or less, they've got a year to do it, 18 months if they're very lucky, and they really have no time to discuss or assess in the middle, or have anything but the minimum guidance from us, so that the Institute's provided a framework in which I think fieldwork was well done, carefully done.
I suppose also, though, I was thinking about the other shifts of direction. I mean, at that particular time, as I say, it was people like Audrey Richard, Gallagher and so on, who were in charge of general social science units. Their students became not only professors of anthropology, but professors of sociology. Were interested perhaps in, were involved in development as it was conceived at that time, and projects of development. But now, social anthropologists in this country, I think, much less involved in that in many ways. I mean, one can't see people playing the central role that Richards and Duckman played. One can't see people extending perhaps quite so much into that field. Or am I wrong? I mean, as an LSE, I mean, perhaps you have.
Well, I think you're perhaps exaggerating, Jack, because though
the central role I was talking about here, not the peripheral role, the central role.
The central role perhaps has shifted to economists or sociologists, but in some respects it was only one or two people in these institutes who were very influential. The rest of us were in many ways rather peripheral. And we were doing very much the sorts of academically oriented research that people do now. And the relationship with governments and with development and with other disciplines were very often mediated through the central person, and the success of that mediation was rather a personal one. I mean, if it was successful, it was because the mediator did it well. But most of us were very concerned to keep from being overtly influenced, I think, or constrained. I had a long debate with my conscience before I wrote a piece for the Kenyan and Ugandan governments about the difference between ancestor worship and a new cult which had sprung up, which was causing a lot of trouble and killing people. in neighbouring Kenya as to whether I should in fact be giving information. I think this is modern graduate students probably have had much the same sort of worries. We did distance ourselves from these things as well.
Well, at one level, yes, but on another level, people were perhaps more involved in problems to do with the role of the chief in government, and simply to make this particular point about Audrey's work, Fowler's work.
Oh, yes.
I mean, work of that kind, which I don't regard as being development in a narrow sense of the word, but in a broader sense of the word. I mean, if you look at, I mean, it was a time when anthropologists were doing studies of kingdoms and were doing studies of political institutions in a major way, and were contributing to African political systems, for example. It's almost impossible to think of African political systems now being written by an anthropologist, because if it was earlier systems, it will be written by a historian. If it's a modern one, it will be written by sociologists or political scientists. I mean, there's very little work on politics in that kind of a sense. I mean, people's involvement is in a sense shifted. I mean, much more shifted perhaps to the symbolic interest of
that's very new. I know when I was writing on initiation ritual, my preoccupation with symbolism was considered very odd, and now it's the thing to study.
Well, I mean, I didn't. Nori Alman said the same thing to me. I mean, I didn't find it odd, and I didn't find it odd then, having come from background in English literature. It seemed to be the kind of thing that one was interested in automatically. But I mean, the creation of it into a specific field of study, and the fact that people go out, you know, concentrate on this area of study, not taking into account wider political issues and so on, which you at least were, in a sense, involved in at some levels, because A, you had this sort of plan of Malinowski's that was shoved at you, and B, I mean, although, in a sense, because you were representative of the colonial regime, you were to some extent involved in the politics of what was going on there.
Yes, to some extent, and I do think though that the development, the speed of development of anthropology since I was a graduate student has meant that it is much harder to do what we were expected to do, which was an all-round, all right, call it functionist study, relating different aspects of social life to one another. It is much harder to do. The detail you are required to produce on one aspect of life is very much greater, I think.
Well, in part because the differentiation itself is greater.
Yes, it's much greater than it ever used to be.
I mean, the differentiation of life itself in those particular areas is greater as well.
Partly, I suppose, but not entirely,
But
because there are people studying very simple, unchanged societies like hunters and gatherers in the middle of Indian jungles, or in the Philippines, where things have changed very little, but what has changed is the anthropologist's preoccupation with details and this and that.
But I mean, how would you make your study of the Giza rituals more detailed than you did at the time? If you're talking about detail, I mean, what else would you have done
I think
now than you would do? What would you have done now differently than you would have done then?
Well, it's difficult to know, because the Gisu found it very hard to produce exegesis, but I think I should have worked on that more than I did. They were impatient with questions like, what does that mean, and why do you do that, and what was that, how did that start, or any of these sorts of questions which the Ndembu seem to have tripping me off their tongue. And perhaps I should have looked harder for Mushona the Hornet.
Well, I didn't know that the Ndembu had them tripping off the tongue. It was perhaps that the field worker was more persistent about
well, it's very interesting because
getting answers to how many angels balanced on the angel pin.
That's possible, but you know that Turner spent some time studying the Gisu, and I was in a muck sweat wondering if he would get the sort of exegetical discussions or the more material on the nature of symbolism than I had managed to get, partly because he was a man and I thought the Gisu might talk more regularly to him. But he didn't do better, and he admitted that they weren't really very keen on discussing why. He used to tell me that's the way it's done. They would say, if you don't do it like that, it isn't Gisu initiation.
So there wasn't a great deal more that
there wasn't a great deal more to get.
I mean, there wasn't a great deal more that you might have done anyhow. We have a few minutes left, and I want to ask you very quickly. I've talked about the Audrey Richards and their effects upon you. What about those other great figures that you encountered when you came back here? Sir Edmund Leach and Professor Reo Fortune.
Well, I think perhaps when I got back, the most amazing experience was Edmund, and he was the examiner in my thesis, in which we had what the external examiner from Oxford thought was an unseemly internal fracas about whether lineages existed in Africa or not. And I regret to say it got to a very simple level of it is, it isn't. I found him very alarming, so that I was quite amazed at my vigour in defending what I suppose was my own territory. But Audrey's work wasn't without its critics, you know, and I'm thinking of someone else who was very much the Cambridge gene, and that is Reo Fortune. He came back from an RAI meeting saying that he had heard an interesting paper of Audrey Richard's, and he'd got up and told her that, of course, Gander clans were 90% water. I thought for a minute, and then having learnt Fortune language, I said, of course, Reo, they're people, and people are 90% water. It's a biological fact. And he turned to me with great anger and said, it's not a biological fact, he said. Any fact is a fact. And he stormed out of the bar.
You had sussed him out.
I had worked out the language, and he didn't like that very much. I think he liked being a mystery.
Yes, I think he created them. But you didn't get much out of Reo intellectually.
No, not really.
I mean, who did you get something out of intellectually?
Well, Myers' discussions were always very helpful, and from reading his work I have found more and more. I got a lot from fellow students, from senior graduate students, from seminars generally, and a lot from Frederick Clark and Noor Yelman, with whom I discussed my work. I think I've always been glad to take ideas whenever I could find them. I think my work is a bit of a collage of other people's ideas, although I'm told it shows very much the influence of the 40s school of anthropology. Perhaps that's because I was so impressionable when I was an undergraduate and never really changed my mind. But I see it myself as having been much influenced by Edmund and his earlier work, not the later work, Political Systems of Higher Intelligence.
Yes.